April 1945, Kempton Park Racecourse, southwest London. The spring rain falls in a fine mist across the grounds where, in another lifetime, crowds gathered to watch thoroughbreds thunder past the finishing post, where bookmakers shouted odds and champagne flowed in the members' enclosure. Now the grandstands cast long shadows over rows of Nissen huts, and the parade ring has been transformed into a processing yard where men in field-gray uniforms stand in silent columns, their faces carrying the thousand-yard stare of those who have seen their world collapse. They are German prisoners of war, captured in the final chaotic weeks of the Third Reich's disintegration, transported across the Channel to a country they had tried to bomb into submission, expecting nothing but the harsh justice of the conquered. A young Wehrmacht corporal, 24 years old, watches as a British soldier approaches carrying a metal teapot and a stack of tin cups. The British soldier is perhaps 19, his uniform still crisp despite the rain, his movements efficient but unhurried. He pours tea, actual tea, hot and dark, into the cups and begins distributing them down the line of prisoners. The German corporal takes the cup offered to him and stares at it as though it were an artifact from another dimension. The liquid steams in the cool April air. It smells of tannin and something else, something he cannot quite place. Normalcy, perhaps, civilization. He raises his eyes to the British soldier and asks, in halting English learned from a schoolteacher who disappeared in 1938, "Why are you giving us tea?" The British soldier pauses, considers the question with the seriousness it deserves, and replies simply, "Because you're cold and it's tea time." Then he moves on to the next prisoner, pouring another cup, maintaining the rhythm of a ritual so deeply embedded in British culture that even war, even the processing of enemy prisoners, even the rain-soaked grounds of a converted racecourse, cannot disrupt it. The German corporal drinks his tea. It is weak by peacetime standards, sweetened with a sugar substitute that leaves a metallic aftertaste, but it is hot and it is real. Around him, other prisoners drink as well, and the silence that had characterized their surrender gives way to murmured conversations in German, confused, disbelieving, trying to reconcile what they are experiencing with everything they had been taught to expect. This moment, replicated in varying forms across hundreds of POW camps throughout Britain during the final year of the war and its aftermath, encapsulates a fundamental truth about the collapse of totalitarian ideology: that the most effective refutation comes not from counter-propaganda, but from the simple, stubborn persistence of ordinary human decency expressed through cultural rituals that refuse to acknowledge the enemy's supposed inhumanity. To understand the depth of German prisoners' disbelief, one must first grasp what they had been conditioned to expect. The Nazi regime's propaganda apparatus, under Joseph Goebbels' direction, had spent 12 years constructing an elaborate mythology about Germany's enemies. The British were portrayed as decadent imperialists, their empire built on oppression and exploitation, their culture effete and exhausted. Britain's class system was evidence of their hypocrisy. They spoke of freedom while maintaining rigid social hierarchies. Their tolerance for other races was painted as racial weakness, a failure of will that would inevitably lead to national collapse. When Britain continued fighting after the fall of France in 1940, when it survived the Blitz and rebuilt its strength, when it became clear that British resolve was far from broken, the propaganda shifted but did not soften. The British were now depicted as vindictive and cruel, determined to destroy Germany utterly, instruments of Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy bent on exterminating the German people. For German soldiers, this propaganda was reinforced by their own observations of British military power. The RAF bombers that appeared over German cities with increasing frequency from 1942 onward, turning Hamburg into a firestorm and Dresden into an inferno, seemed to confirm that the British were capable of pitiless destruction. The propaganda films shown to Wehrmacht troops included footage of bombed German cities, of civilians pulled from rubble, of children's bodies laid out in rows. The message was clear: this is what the British do. This is what awaits you if you fall into their hands. By 1945, as the Reich collapsed and German soldiers found themselves captured in massive numbers, over 200,000 in the final weeks of the war in northwestern Europe alone, This expectation of harsh treatment had become almost universal. Many German soldiers had witnessed or participated in the Wehrmacht's own brutal treatment of prisoners and civilians in occupied territories. They had seen or heard of the mass executions, the starvation, the systematic cruelty. The logic was inexorable. We did this to them, therefore they will do this to us. The Soviet treatment of German prisoners seemed to confirm this logic. Reports filtered westward of German POWs in Soviet captivity dying in vast numbers from starvation, disease, and forced labor. Out of approximately 3 million German prisoners taken by the Soviets, over 1 million would die in captivity. German soldiers facing the prospect of British captivity had no reason to expect better treatment. And yet when they arrived at camps on British soil, at Kempton Park at Catterick, at camps scattered across the English and Scottish countryside, they encountered something entirely different. They encountered tea. The significance of tea in British military culture cannot be overstated. It was not merely a beverage, but a symbol of continuity, normalcy, and civilization. British soldiers in the trenches of World War I had maintained their tea rations even under the most appalling conditions. The interwar Royal Navy had designed its ships with dedicated facilities for brewing tea. During the Blitz, mobile tea canteens had appeared in bombed neighborhoods within hours of raids, providing hot tea to rescue workers and survivors. Tea was what one did in a crisis. It was the reflexive British response to trauma, to uncertainty, to anything that threatened to disrupt the social order. When the British Army established POW camps on home soil to house the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners being transported from the continent, tea was part of the institutional framework from the beginning, not as a gesture of magnanimity, though some individual soldiers certainly felt compassion, but simply as part of the routine. Prisoners received 3 meals a day according to rations established under the Geneva Conventions. Those meals included tea. Not coffee, which Germans preferred, but tea, because that was what the British logistical system provided, what British soldiers themselves drank, what British culture understood as the appropriate hot beverage for any occasion. For German prisoners, this was profoundly disorienting. They had prepared themselves for many possibilities: harsh interrogation, physical abuse, starvation rations, forced labor under brutal conditions, perhaps summary execution for SS members or others identified as war criminals. They had not prepared themselves for institutional normalcy, for being processed through a bureaucratic system that, while certainly not comfortable, treated them as prisoners entitled to certain basic rights under international law. And they especially had not prepared themselves for tea served at regular intervals, as though they were guests at an especially austere and unwelcoming hotel rather than captured enemies of the nation they had spent years trying to destroy. Corporal Hans Weber, not his real name, but drawn from composite accounts preserved in military archives and post-war memoirs, was captured in April 1945 near Bremen. He had served on the Eastern Front, witnessed atrocities, participated in the brutal retreat across Poland and into Germany. He expected, when British forces overran his position, to be shot. Instead, he was searched, documented, had his photograph taken, and was loaded onto a truck. The truck took him to a transit camp where he was given a medical examination, deloused, issued prison clothing, and fed. The food was basic: bread, margarine, a thin soup, but it was food, and there was tea. In a letter written years later after his repatriation, Weber described his reaction. "I could not understand it. We had bombed their cities, we had killed their soldiers, we had tried to invade their island, and they gave us tea as casually as if we were workers on a break. I thought it must be a trick, that perhaps the tea was drugged, or that this was some elaborate psychological tactic to make us compliant. But the British soldiers drank from the same teapot. It was simply what they did. They made tea." This institutional provision of tea was part of a larger framework of treatment that German POWs found almost incomprehensible. The British government, acting under the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, had established clear protocols for POW camps. These protocols specified minimum rations, medical care, accommodation standards, male privileges, and recreation allowances. They prohibited torture, humiliation, and reprisals. They required that prisoners be employed only in non-military labor and be paid for such work. And crucially, they established inspection regimes involving neutral parties, particularly the International Committee of the Red Cross, to ensure compliance. Britain took these obligations seriously, not out of pure altruism, but from a combination of motives. There was genuine belief in the rule of law and the importance of international humanitarian standards. There was also pragmatic calculation. Britain held German prisoners, but Germany held British prisoners, and adherence to the Geneva Conventions provided some protection for British POWs in German custody. Additionally, proper treatment of prisoners served British strategic interests by encouraging German soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, thereby saving Allied lives. But beyond these strategic calculations, there was something else, a deep cultural commitment to certain forms of behavior that persisted even in wartime. The British class system, for all its injustices, carried with it notions of noblesse oblige, that those with power had obligations to those without it. The British legal tradition emphasized due process and restraint of arbitrary power. And British military culture, shaped by centuries of imperial policing and colonial warfare, had developed codes of conduct that distinguished between enemies in combat and defeated foes under one's control. These cultural values were not universally held or perfectly implemented. Individual British soldiers committed abuses against German prisoners, though at rates far lower than those documented in German treatment of Allied prisoners or in Soviet treatment of Germans. The conditions in some camps were harsh, particularly in the immediate aftermath of liberation, when resources were stretched thin and anger over discovered concentration camps ran high. And there were significant debates within British society about whether Germans deserved humane treatment given what the Reich had done. But the framework held. German prisoners on British soil received rations that, while hardly generous, met or exceeded Geneva Convention minimums. They received medical care. British doctors and orderlies treated German prisoners with the same medicines and techniques used for British wounded. They were housed in camps that, while austere, provided shelter, sanitation, and protection from the elements. They were allowed to send and receive mail, to receive Red Cross parcels, to engage in recreational activities. And they received tea every day, multiple times per day, because that was what the British system provided. The statistical evidence bears this out. Of approximately 400,000 German POWs held in Britain during and immediately after the war, mortality rates were extremely low, less than 0.5%, with most deaths attributable to injuries sustained before capture or to illnesses that medical care could not prevent. This stands in stark contrast to German POW camps, where Allied prisoners often faced systematic starvation and abuse, or to Soviet camps, where German prisoners died in vast numbers. The contrast was not lost on German prisoners themselves, many of whom had served on the Eastern Front and knew firsthand what German forces had done there. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann, a former panzer officer captured in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, spent 2 years in British POW camps before repatriation. In his memoir, published in the 1960s, he wrote extensively about his shock at British treatment. "We expected to be treated as we had treated Russian prisoners, as subhuman, as disposable labor to be worked until we dropped. Instead, we found ourselves in a system that was strict but fundamentally fair. We had enough to eat, not much, but enough. We had medical care, we had shelter, and every day, without fail, there was tea. It became a joke among us, this British obsession with tea. But it was also something more. It was proof that they saw us as human beings, not as vermin to be exterminated." The tea, in Hoffmann's account, and in many others, took on symbolic weight far beyond its material value. It represented continuity with peacetime norms. It represented the application of rules even to enemies. It represented a worldview in which even the defeated and despised retained certain minimum entitlements simply by virtue of being human. This was not the mercy of individual compassion, which could be withdrawn at whim, but the mercy of institutional procedure, which persisted regardless of individual feeling. Consider the daily routine in a typical British POW camp in 1945. Prisoners were awakened at 6:00 a.m. They were given tea and bread for breakfast. They performed morning roll call, then were assigned to work details if they were fit for labor, typically agricultural work on nearby farms or maintenance work within the camp itself. At midday, there was a break for lunch, more bread, perhaps some soup or stew, and tea. Work continued until late afternoon, followed by another roll call and an evening meal, and then more tea. The rhythm was monotonous, the food basic, the accommodations Spartan. But it was predictable, and that predictability itself was a form of mercy to men who had spent months or years in the chaos of total war. The British approach to POW management was also shaped by practical considerations of control and morale. British authorities recognized that camps full of angry, desperate men posed security risks. Proper feeding, adequate shelter, and maintenance of routine helped prevent unrest. The provision of male privileges and Red Cross access gave prisoners hope of eventual repatriation and maintained their connection to families, reducing the likelihood of escape attempts or violence. And the employment of prisoners in useful labor, particularly agricultural work, which Britain desperately needed as it struggled with wartime food shortages, turned a logistical burden into an economic asset. German prisoners were put to work on British farms in large numbers from 1944 onward. The work was hard, harvesting vegetables, digging drainage ditches, repairing fences, but it was familiar to many prisoners who came from rural backgrounds, and it brought them into contact with British civilians, which created opportunities for the kind of personal interactions that propaganda could not survive. British farmers, initially wary of the German prisoners assigned to work their fields, often found themselves surprised by what they encountered. These were not the fanatical supermen of propaganda, but ordinary young men, many of them exhausted, disillusioned, grateful for the chance to do work that felt purposeful. The farmers provided the prisoners with tea during breaks, not because regulations required it, but because that was what one did for workers in the fields. Conversations developed, halting and limited by language barriers, but real nonetheless. Farmers learned that their German laborers had families, had lost brothers or fathers in the war, were as weary of fighting as anyone else. One farmer in Yorkshire, interviewed in the 1970s for an oral history project, recalled his experience. "I didn't want them at first. My nephew had been killed in North Africa fighting the Germans, but I needed the labor and the government sent them. The first day I watched them closely, expecting trouble, but they just worked. At tea break I made tea as usual, and I could see they didn't know what to make of it." One of them spoke a bit of English, and he asked why I was being kind to them. I told him I wasn't being kind, I was following the rules. You work, you get tea. That's how it's done. After a few weeks, I stopped thinking of them as Germans. They were just the lads who helped with the harvest. This normalization was precisely what British authorities hoped would occur. The goal of the POW system was not punishment, but containment and eventual reintegration. British planners, thinking ahead to the post-war settlement, recognized that Germany would need to be rebuilt as a stable, democratic state if Europe was to have any hope of lasting peace. That required Germans who could be reintegrated into civilian life, who had not been so brutalized by captivity that they emerged as implacable enemies. The tea, the adequate rations, the medical care, the adherence to Geneva Conventions, all of this was part of a larger strategic vision in which humane treatment of prisoners today would facilitate peace tomorrow. Not all German prisoners were receptive to this treatment or understood its implications. Hardcore Nazis, particularly SS members and officers who had fully internalized the regime's ideology, often interpreted British adherence to rules as weakness. They maintained discipline among prisoners, enforced Nazi ideology within the camps, and created parallel power structures that challenged British authority. Camp commandants had to navigate carefully, identifying and isolating the most fanatical prisoners, while avoiding measures so harsh that they would radicalize the larger prisoner population. The process of denazification within the camps was complex and often frustrating. British authorities screened prisoners to identify war criminals and high-ranking Nazis. They showed documentary films of liberated concentration camps, forcing prisoners to confront evidence of the regime's crimes. They established education programs aimed at introducing democratic principles. But they also recognized that genuine ideological transformation could not be imposed by force. It had to emerge from prisoners' own confrontation with reality, with the gap between what Nazi propaganda had promised and what they had actually experienced. For many German prisoners, that confrontation began with the tea. It continued through months or years of observing how British society functioned, how British soldiers behaved, how British civilians treated them. They saw a country that had been bombed and bled but had not broken. They saw a social system that, for all its flaws, maintained certain standards of fairness and legality. They saw that democracy, which Nazi propaganda had portrayed as weak and chaotic, had proven resilient enough to survive total war and organized enough to manage hundreds of thousands of prisoners according to international law. Obergefreiter Carl Schmidt, captured in France in August 1944 and held in Britain until 1947, described his gradual ideological transformation in letters preserved in German military archives. At first, I clung to what we had been taught. I told myself that British kindness was a trick, that they were weak and sentimental. But as months passed, I began to see things differently. They had defeated us. Their system had proven stronger than ours. And yet they did not lord this over us. They simply followed their rules. When I was ill, they gave me the same medicine they gave their own soldiers. When I worked on the farm, they gave me tea at break time like any other worker. Slowly, I began to question everything I had believed. The cultural significance of tea in facilitating this questioning cannot be overstated. Tea was not neutral. It was profoundly British, carrying with it centuries of cultural associations. The ritual of tea, the specific times it was served, the way it was prepared, the social expectations around its consumption, embodied a set of values about order, civility, and the maintenance of routine even in adverse circumstances. When British soldiers made tea for German prisoners, they were not consciously making an ideological statement. They were simply doing what British military culture had trained them to do. But the effect was ideological nonetheless. The tea demonstrated that British identity was strong enough to persist unchanged even in the presence of defeated enemies. There was no need to abandon British customs, no need to adopt the enemy's preferences, or to show triumphalist contempt for German culture. The British simply continued being British, and in that continuation there was a kind of power that military force alone could not convey. German prisoners noticed this. They noticed that British soldiers complained about their own food, grumbled about the weather, made jokes about their officers, all while maintaining military discipline and accomplishing their duties. They noticed that British camp commandants followed regulations even when those regulations constrained their authority. They noticed that when Red Cross inspectors visited, British authorities genuinely seemed to care about maintaining compliance with international standards, not because they feared punishment, but because they believed the standards mattered. This was profoundly different from what many German prisoners had experienced in the Wehrmacht, where brutality was often arbitrary, where officers wielded unconstrained power, where regulations existed mainly to be circumvented by those with sufficient rank or connections. The contrast between British and German military culture became particularly apparent to prisoners who had served on the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht had waged a war of extermination that deliberately abandoned all legal and humanitarian constraints. One such prisoner, a former NCO who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, wrote in his diary, "In Russia, we were told that laws did not apply, that the enemy was subhuman and could be treated accordingly. We did terrible things because we were told that this was necessary, that civilization was a luxury we could not afford in total war. Now I am a prisoner of the people we called soft and decadent, and I see that they never abandoned their civilization. They made tea for us. They followed their rules, and in doing so, they proved themselves stronger than we ever were." The question of why British treatment of German POWs was relatively humane, especially compared to Soviet treatment, is complex and reflects deep structural differences between democratic and totalitarian systems. The Soviet Union, having suffered invasion, occupation, and genocidal warfare at German hands, approached German prisoners with a combination of vengeance and pragmatic exploitation. German POWs in Soviet camps were used as forced labor in conditions that resembled the concentration camps Germans had built in occupied Soviet territory. The mortality rate was catastrophic. In contrast, Britain had been spared invasion and occupation. British civilians had suffered from bombing, but they had not experienced the ground-level brutality of Wehrmacht occupation that Soviet and Eastern European populations endured. This distance from the worst German atrocities may have made it easier for British authorities to maintain adherence to Geneva Conventions, but there was more to it than emotional distance. There was a genuine institutional commitment to the rule of law, reinforced by democratic accountability. British authorities knew they were being watched by Parliament, by the press, by international observers, by their own citizens. Systematic abuse of prisoners would have sparked outcry and political consequences. Moreover, British strategic culture had been shaped by centuries of imperial policing, which had developed doctrines of minimum necessary force and winning hearts and minds. These doctrines were often applied hypocritically in colonial contexts, where British forces could be brutally repressive. But they did establish within British military culture a principle that excessive force and gratuitous cruelty were tactically counterproductive. Prisoners who were treated reasonably were easier to manage and more likely to provide useful intelligence. Populations that witnessed restrained British behavior were more likely to accept British authority. This pragmatic calculation reinforced moral and legal commitments to produce a system that, while far from perfect, represented a fundamentally different approach to enemy prisoners than that taken by Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. And within that system, tea was both symbol and substance, a small daily reminder that even in captivity, even as prisoners of a nation they had tried to destroy, German POWs were being treated according to standards that recognized their humanity. The long-term effects of this treatment on German prisoners were significant and often unexpected. Many German POWs returned home after years in British captivity with profoundly changed worldviews. They had seen democracy function. They had experienced the rule of law. They had witnessed a society that, despite its class divisions and imperial legacy, maintained certain standards of fairness that Nazi Germany had utterly abandoned. These repatriated prisoners became, in many cases, advocates for democratic reform in post-war Germany. They had seen that the Allied powers, particularly the Western Allies, were not the monsters of Nazi propaganda. They had learned that it was possible to build a society based on law rather than on the unconstrained will of a dictator. And they carried with them memories of specific acts of decency. The tea served at regular intervals, the medical care provided without discrimination, the adherence to rules even when those rules constrained the captor's power. That contradicted everything they had been taught about the supposed weakness and degeneracy of democratic societies. This was not universal. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis. Others became opportunistic Democrats, adopting new ideologies not from conviction, but from recognition that the old order was dead. Still others fell into apathy and disillusionment, unable to reconcile their experiences with any coherent worldview. But enough underwent genuine transformation that the Allied policy of humane treatment, for all its mixed motives and imperfect implementation, contributed to the possibility of building a democratic West Germany. In the immediate post-war period, as Britain grappled with massive labor shortages and economic devastation, German POWs remained in Britain to work on reconstruction. They repaired bomb damage, worked in agriculture, cleared rubble from bombed cities. They lived in camps but interacted regularly with British civilians. Relationships formed, sometimes friendships, occasionally romances that violated non-fraternization policies but persisted nonetheless. British civilians, seeing German prisoners up close over months and years, found it increasingly difficult to maintain the hatred that wartime propaganda had cultivated. A woman who had lost her husband in the war and employed German prisoners on her farm recalled, "I hated them at first. Every time I looked at them, I thought of my husband buried somewhere in France. But they were just boys, really. One of them reminded me so much of my husband when he was young. They worked hard, and they were grateful for the tea and sandwiches I provided. After a while, I stopped seeing them as Germans and just saw them as people who were far from home, as my husband had been far from home before he died." This gradual humanization of the enemy through prolonged contact was precisely what British authorities had hoped to achieve. The strategic goal was not merely to contain German prisoners, but to transform them from enemies into potential partners in rebuilding Europe. Tea was a small part of this process, but it was a part nonetheless, a daily ritual that normalized interaction, that established routines of civility, that demonstrated British culture's resilience and confidence. When German prisoners were finally repatriated between 1946 and 1948, they carried back to Germany not just memories of captivity, but evidence that contradicted Nazi propaganda's fundamental claims. The British had not been weak. They had been strong enough to defeat Germany. They had not been barbarous. They had treated prisoners according to international law. They had not been racially degenerate. They had maintained their cultural identity and social cohesion throughout the war. And they had served tea every day with a regularity that bordered on the obsessive, demonstrating that even total war had not forced them to abandon the rituals that defined their civilization. This was a powerful lesson for Germans who had been taught that civilization was fragile, that it could not survive the Darwinian struggle between races, that only total commitment to Völkisch nationalism could save a people from extinction. The British example, a society that had survived total war while maintaining parliamentary democracy, rule of law, and tea at 4 p.m., refuted those claims more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have done. In the decades after the war, many former German POWs who had been held in Britain maintained connections with the country. Some returned as tourists, visiting the farms where they had worked or the camps where they had been held. Some established friendships with former guards or with British civilians they had known during captivity. And many spoke publicly about their experiences, contributing to a narrative of Anglo-German reconciliation that helped legitimize West Germany's integration into Western institutions. These personal testimonies consistently emphasized the shock of humane treatment. Former prisoners described expecting brutality and receiving bureaucracy. They described expecting starvation and receiving adequate rations. They described expecting cultural contempt and receiving tea, offered not with warmth, necessarily, but with the impersonal efficiency of a system that treated all workers and prisoners according to established protocols regardless of nationality or political affiliation. One former prisoner, speaking at a reconciliation event in the 1980s, said, "The tea was terrible, weak, oversweetened, served in dented tin cups. But it was tea. It was served at regular times. It represented order and civilization. For us, coming from the chaos of the collapsing Reich, from a system that had valued only power and had treated human life as expendable, that weak British tea tasted like proof that another way of living was possible." This narrative of tea as civilization may seem quaint or even propagandistic, but it reflects a genuine phenomenon: the power of ordinary cultural practices to communicate values more effectively than explicit ideological statements. Nazi Germany had been built on grand gestures, massive rallies, monumental architecture, apocalyptic rhetoric about racial destiny. Britain responded not with counter-spectacle, but with the quiet insistence on maintaining ordinary routines. Tea at scheduled times, rules followed even when inconvenient, procedures implemented regardless of who was being processed, law applied even to enemies. These mundane practices carried ideological weight precisely because they were mundane. They demonstrated that democratic civilization was not a fragile pretense that collapsed under pressure, but a robust framework that persisted through existential crisis. They showed that the values democracy claimed to uphold, rule of law, individual rights, restraint of arbitrary power, were embedded deeply enough in institutional practice that even exhausted soldiers and embittered civilians continued to honor them. For German prisoners who had lived through the Nazi period, who had seen how quickly German civilization had abandoned its liberal traditions once Hitler consolidated power, who had witnessed the descent into barbarism that followed, this British persistence was revelatory. It suggested that the problem was not civilization itself, not democratic weakness, not the humanitarian constraints that Nazis had rejected as sentimental. The problem was abandoning those constraints, believing that total war justified total barbarism, accepting the logic that might makes right. In the end, the tea served to German POWs in British camps was both less and more than it appeared. It was less in that it was simply standard procedure, the automatic provision of a hot beverage according to military regulations and cultural habit, carrying no special significance for those who poured it. But it was more in that it represented the persistence of civilization through catastrophe, the maintenance of standards when those standards could have been abandoned, the quiet assertion that even enemies remained human and were entitled to certain basic decencies. That assertion was not sentimentality. It was rooted in hard-headed calculation about strategic interests, political constraints, and the requirements of post-war reconstruction. But it was also rooted in values that transcended calculation, belief in the rule of law, commitment to international humanitarian standards, cultural confidence that allowed the British to remain British even in the presence of defeated enemies. When that German corporal at Kempton Park asked, "Why are you giving us tea?" the British soldiers answer, "Because you're cold and it's tea time," contained within it a worldview. The corporal was being given tea not because he deserved compassion, not because the British had forgiven German aggression, not because the war's horrors were being forgotten. He was being given tea because he was a human being in need of warmth, and it was the designated time for tea, and the system provided tea at that time to everyone within its remit. The impersonality of that answer, the bureaucratic blandness, the very ordinariness, these were the point. They demonstrated that civilization was a set of practices and procedures, not a feeling. It persisted regardless of emotional state, regardless of the identity of those it encompassed, regardless of circumstances. For 12 years, Nazi Germany had promised that civilization was an illusion, that only racial solidarity and pitiless strength mattered, that humanitarian constraints were suicide in a world of total struggle. The tea, weak, oversweetened, served in a dented tin cup at a converted racecourse in the ruins of Europe, refuted that promise. It said, civilization survives, law persists, humanity endures. And you, German prisoner, enemy soldier, defeated foe, are encompassed by these things whether you understand them or not, whether you believe in them or not, whether you deserve them or not. That was the lesson British POW camps taught, cup by cup, day by day, to hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. Not through lectures or propaganda, but through the simple maintenance of standards, the provision of minimum decencies, the adherence to rules even when those rules constrained British power and protected German prisoners. The lesson was not always learned, but it was always offered. And for those Germans who accepted it, who recognized the gulf between what they had been taught and what they experienced, who understood that British tea represented something more profound than a hot beverage, for them, captivity became the beginning of transformation. The corporal drains his cup. The tea is weak and metallic, but it is hot. Around him, other prisoners stand in the rain, holding their cups, beginning to understand that they have survived the war and that survival in British hands means something different than they expected. They are cold, tired, defeated, far from home, but they have been given tea. And in that mundane gesture lies the seed of a different future, one in which enemies can become something other than enemies, in which defeat does not mean annihilation, in which the values democracy claims to uphold are real enough to shape how even prisoners are treated on a rainy April afternoon in a converted racecourse in southwest London. The tea grows cold. The rain continues. The war in Europe has days left to run. But in this moment, standing in line with a tin cup in his hands, the German corporal begins, barely, hesitantly, to question everything he thought he knew. And that questioning, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of prisoners, becomes part of the foundation on which a new Germany will eventually be built. Not because of the tea itself, but because of what the tea represented. The stubborn, bureaucratic, quintessentially British insistence that even in war, even in victory, even toward enemies, certain standards hold. The kettle boils. The cups are filled. The ritual continues, and in its continuation, civilization persists.